Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of FightBackNews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggles. I'm your host, Richard Berg. We have a very special guest, one of the giants of the Black Liberation Movement, Frank Chapman. Frank was wrongfully incarcerated as a teenager at age 19, sentenced wrongfully to life plus 50 years. In jail, Frank became a freedom fighter. He joined forces with many activists, including Angela Davis, and fought his way out of jail. And now for more than 5 decades, he has continued to fight for Black liberation and socialism. Currently, Frank serves as the executive director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. He's the field organizer for the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and he sits on the Central Committee of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. We asked Frank to be here because he's written one of the most important books of the 21st century, I believe. And we asked him to come and talk about his book. It's called Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism. Frank uses a historic lens to look at the theories and the practices together. He looks back at history and figures out, is this stuff really working, or does this really stack up? And basically, Frank's view is practice is the sole criteria of truth. And so when you have a theory, if it doesn't stand up in practice, it isn't worth very much. And so Frank, he talks about racism as an idea, but also he talks about a national question. And you may have heard this in our last episode with Marisol Marquez, where she argued forcefully and persuasively, I think, that there was a Chicano nation in the Southwest and that there was a national question that affected Chicano people here in the United States. Frank, I think, would say the same thing about African Americans in the areas that they make up a majority in the Black Belt South. I want to take a second just to talk about this idea of what is a nation or a national question. And for Marxist-Leninists, they define a nation just like this. A nation is a historically evolved, stable community of language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a community of culture. Let me say that one more time. A nation is a historically evolved, stable community of language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a community of culture. So Frank, you'll hear some of this in his discussions today, and if you go back and listen to Marisol's, you'll hear it there as well. So also, before we get into the interview, though, I want to thank all those who provided feedback to Fight Back Radio about our podcast and how to make it better. And if you'd like to do that with this one or anything we've done in the past or suggest ideas, you can contact me at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. That's richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. Also, I want to encourage people to subscribe and to like and to give 5 stars or whatever best thing you can do to help promote us, because people will, it moves us up the stack and allows more people to hear and find us. So please do that. Anyways, without further ado, here's Frank Chapman. Okay, so I'm here with Frank Chapman. Welcome to Fight Back, Frank. We're glad to have you here. We're excited to talk about your book, Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism.
Well, thank you for having me, Richard. I really appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I think it'll be rich. I wanted to start with, the title of the book, Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism. It's a mouthful. So, what could you tell us? What is Black liberation?
Well, historically defined, Black liberation is the movement of Black people in this country to liberate themselves from the oppression that's been imposed upon them by the government of the United States. And I say the government is because that has been the problem from the very beginning. From when this republic was founded in 1776. Then there was slavery. And it was slavery that was recognized by the government, the newly found government. And so the struggle for Black liberation became a struggle to get all of those rights which this government was denying our people. The main thing then was getting free from slavery, getting to a point where we were not considered to be property, bought and sold, like cattle. And then after slavery was abolished, and with the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment gave us equal protection of the law and made us citizens by birth, and the 15th Amendment gave us the right to vote, that has kind of defined what the Black liberation movement politically is about. It's about getting those freedoms enforced, which we have been, as Dr. King used to say, which we've been given on paper. You know, we've been given the right to vote on paper. We've been given equal protection of the law on paper. But getting those rights enforced has been the principal agenda of the Black liberation movement.
So let me stop you there, Frank. So is it basically to look for things that, like in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, that sort of thing that excluded black people, to include them in those kind of democratic rights? Is that what Black liberation is?
Black liberation is the struggle for black equality, making us equal under the law, as is said in the 14th Amendment, and about giving us the opportunities to participate in government so we can be a part in determining what those laws are. So,
okay. So you talk a lot about in your book about Black Reconstruction, and that was an opportunity, possibly. Du Bois talks about this as well in his book about Reconstruction in the South. Why is that significant, and what happened there that helped either promote or push back Black liberation?
Well, what happened in the South was that after the Civil War, when slavery had been abolished in terms of black people being property, that was the slavery that was abolished. Black people could no longer be bought and sold as property. The slavery that was not abolished is that black people could be enslaved if they were convicted of crimes. So if you read the 13th Amendment, it says slavery is abolished except for the commitment of crimes. Okay, people convicted of committing a crime can be put into penal slavery. So there's that, and then there's also the question of the exercising of our rights, and do we get the protection of the government in exercising those rights? And of course, during the Reconstruction era, we did get the protection of the government in exercising those rights. There were federal troops in the South who saw to it that we were allowed to vote, that were able to squash Ku Klux Klan terrorism, and also the fact that black people themselves were armed through the Union League, and you also had black troops in the South that were armed. And so, given the armed might of the state being used in our behalf, we were able to suppress and in some cases eliminate the Ku Klux Klan, and start reconstructing the government of the South in a way that would be carrying out the mandates of the Constitution, giving everybody in the South equal protection of the law, and giving black folks the right to vote.
So what happened then? I mean, from then till now, things haven't progressed in an even line, having more rights, movements towards equality. I mean, most people, and a lot of commentators that we look at say, oh, things are getting better, they're getting better, and it seems like from what you're saying right now, things might have been better back then than they are right now. So what actually happened? How did
in the book we go into detailed particularity about what happened. What happened is that for 10 years, from 1867 until 1877, there was Reconstruction. Some people refer to it as radical Reconstruction. Du Bois referred to it as black Reconstruction. There was this brief period of time in which black people had the political power to enforce these things, enforce their rights themselves. And during that brief period of time, you had more democratic advances in America than in any other time in American history. Public education come out of that period. A number of capital punishment laws were struck down during that period. During that period, there were strides made in the direction to giving women the right to vote. So there was a lot that happened during that period. There was a democratic advance for this country. In 1877, during the so-called Great Compromise, when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president, what he agreed to do was to take the troops out of the South, the federal troops out of the South. They disbanded the Union League, and this left the organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and other organizations founded by ex-Confederate soldiers like the Knights of Camellia. This gave them an opportunity to bring about a reign of terror, which is exactly what they did. And so the constitutionally elected governments of the South during that time in Carolina and Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and Louisiana, all throughout the South, those governments were overthrown by Ku Klux Klan terrorism, and set up in their place was governments that later on came to be known as Jim Crow. That is, what you had happen is black Reconstruction, the democratic governments were overthrown, and set up in their place was really dictatorships of racists and former slaveholders.
So your book it's titled, as I said, Black Liberation and Socialism. So you've talked a little bit about the origins of the struggles for black liberation in the United States, but the question of socialism goes beyond black people to the working class. What's the relationship, and why is it important for black people to care about socialism or to care about working class struggles?
Well, black people were brought to the United States to work, brought in chains, and throughout this hemisphere. The socialist movement declared itself in 1848 with the Communist Manifesto, and in the closing words of the Communist Manifesto, it says, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, and the world to gain." And Karl Marx was not just talking about white workers or workers in Europe. He was talking about workers of the world, which included a large number of black workers. In fact, the majority of the workers in the world are black and brown, are non-white. So this is who he was talking about. And the Black Liberation Movement and the Communist Movement and the Socialist Movement, they automatically connected from the very beginning, from the time of the Communist Manifesto until the present. These two movements have been connected. During the Civil War, the International Workmen's Association, which was the first international that was formed by Karl Marx and others in the communist movement, they refused to unload Confederate ships. Communists who came to the United States during that period, like Joseph Wiedemeyer, who had some military experience in the Prussian army, he became a general in the Union Army and also the founder of the first communist clubs in the United States. These first communist clubs had high on their agenda the question of slavery. You could not belong to one of these clubs if you were not an abolitionist, if you did not fight for the abolition of slavery. So from the very beginning of the communist movement, there's been this relationship between the struggle for black liberation and the struggle for socialism. And Marx saw it as inseparable, and more and more black people came to see it as inseparable as time went on. But back then, Marx, he made it clear that it was inseparable by saying that labor in the white skin cannot be free if it's enslaved and branded in a black skin. So that made it very, very clear that you could not have a successful struggle for socialism which did not address the question of black liberation.
So in your book, Frank, you talk about the period after the First International as well. So after Karl Marx had passed away, and there was a Second International was formed, and then you talk about how this understanding of black liberation that was vocalized by Marx and the communist clubs that you talk about, wasn't as strong during that period. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the founders of scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, they made it clear that the working class struggles would include black people, as I just stated earlier. What happened in 1871, shortly after the Paris Commune, was a splitting up of the First International, and that split consisted of the Lassalleans, the socialists following Lassalle, broke with Karl Marx, and they did not see this question in the same way. They felt that white workers had to bring about a victory for socialism, and then as a result of that, black workers and brown workers would benefit. All other workers would benefit. This was basically a betrayal of the things that I just said earlier, and clearly a revision of what Marx had laid down. And it became characteristic of the Second International that they did not address the colonial question, and they did not address the question of black liberation in the United States. They just didn't do it. And they became more and more reformist. They began to abandon the struggle for self-empowerment of the working class and to rely more and more on reforms. And Bernstein, who became one of the ideological leaders of this movement, he had an expression, that we fight for bread and butter issues only. So reforms were everything, and revolution nothing. Reforms forever, revolution never. That was more or less the way they organized, and so they took the revolutionary cutting edge off of Marxism and turned it into a reformist movement.
So related to that, I think a lot of people in the United States talk of racism as a bad idea that we need to expose, or people need to let go, and that it's fading or whatever. But you talk about a national question, and you talk about black liberation in the context of a national question. What do you mean by that? And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, black people have considered themselves a nation in this country ever since the 1830s. It started with the Colored People's Convention movement back in the 19th century. And as a nation, we realized that we had to demand our right to self-determination. And that's a revolutionary demand, because that means that we want the right to govern ourselves, and that we, as a people, have that right. That's an unalienable right that we have as a people. And that's what I mean in the book when I say the black liberation movement is a revolutionary movement, because that's a democratic revolutionary demand. And we're not talking about fighting racism as an idea. Of course we fight racism. But racism in the United States is institutionalized. And the reason why it's institutionalized is because of profit. The economic foundations of racism has to do with capitalism, has to do with black people being super exploited for profit. It's always been about that. And to deal with it in that fashion is to deal with it in a revolutionary fashion. To talk about it as an idea, that's not revolutionary. That at best is reform, and it's ill-directed reform, because it's not the idea of race, which is a fake idea, a false idea. There's no scientific basis for race. It's not the idea of race that has us in bondage. It's economic exploitation. And so that's why we say that. We say that the struggle against racism is not a revolutionary struggle. It's a struggle against ideas, wrong ideas that are propagated and institutionalized by the powers that be, by the capitalist class.
So the real issue here then is not bad ideas, but questions of power. Am I right there? And is it so things like the Voting Rights Act, for example, or the right to vote that's being challenged across the country right now? Is that why this kind of thing is important? Would you say?
Yeah, I talk about it in the book in those terms. It's important because it's like there's this famous quote from Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Secretary. He was talking to white people who have racist ideas. He says, if you're in power with your racist ideas, then I have a problem. He said, but if I'm in power with your racist ideas, then you have a problem. And that kind of simplifies it for me, In other words, it's not about so much changing people's minds as instituting and carrying out policies that will change the conditions of living for black people, and that's a question of political power. That's not a question of whether or not you like me or I like you, or you got racist beliefs and I have anti-racist beliefs. This is settled by who has the political power.
So let me try to bring us from the 19th century into the 20th century. You talked a lot about the deep roots of racism and the struggles, particularly in the 19th century, in the post-slavery time and even during slavery times. But in the 20th century, particularly the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, some of the left wing of the socialist movement started to grapple with this national question, and not just for black people, but for colonialized people and others around the world, and there was this struggle within the Second International. How do you view that? I mean, the guys like Bernstein and others that you were talking about, Lenin and others went up against them. So how did you how would you characterize that struggle and how it came out?
Let me. In the introduction to the book, I start out with a quote from the Communist International Manifesto of 1921, I believe. The Communist International breaks once and for all with the traditions of the Second International, which in reality only recognize the white race. Now, the reason why I use that quote is because it was Lenin and the Third International and the formation of the Third International that addressed this question of the revisionism that had been going on all the time, and that is that socialism was recognizing the white race. So they said that we are recognizing that workers of all races, all creeds, have to be engaged in the struggle for socialism. And so they went about organizing that by forming the Third International. The Third International went about reorganizing the communist movement across the globe along these lines, that we will no longer subscribe to the notion that socialism is for white people. We will fight for socialism on behalf of the international working class, which is multiracial and multinational.
So here in the United States, around that same time, there was a Communist Party formed here all over the world. Pretty much every country formed communist parties after the Russian Revolution, after Lenin formed the Communist or Third International.
True.
So how did that play out? That what you're talking about right now, this moving from socialism for white people to socialism for everybody. How did that play out in the United States in the early 20th century?
Well, I really would encourage people to read the book to find out how that played out, because there's a detailed discussion in the book about that. We talk about the proceedings of the various congresses of the Communist International, and by the time they had the fourth Congress, they had came up with the theses on the colonial question, and on what they called back then the Negro question in the United States. And basically what they were saying is that communists have a responsibility, an obligation, and a duty to stand in unconditional solidarity with the national liberation movements going on in the colonies and with the Negro movement in the United States. And they made it incumbent upon all of the parties who joined the Third International to do this. If you did not adopt this thesis, if you refused to go by this thesis, then you could not be a member of the Third International. That was the requirement of membership in the Communist International. You had to take on the national question. You had to be in unconditional support of the struggles for national liberation going on in the colonies at that time, and also the question of Negro liberation going on in the United States at that time.
So there was a guy named Harry Haywood from the United States, and there was people around him and others that were trying to implement that line within the party here and to actually struggle for that. Could you talk a little bit about who is Harry Haywood and who was
Yeah,
what was
not
going on?
only was he was a communist from the United States, not only a black communist, not only was they trying to implement that line, they were a part of the committee that formulated the theses that I just talked about. There was a committee that consisted of 5 black people. Harry Haywood was one of them, and a Japanese comrade, Sentayama. And they are responsible for the drafting of the resolution. Now, when Haywood came back to the United States after spending some time in Russia addressing this question, the Communist Party was already in motion, but he fought for the implementation of the line. But like I said, the Communist Party was already in motion on it. And so they sent people into the Deep South at that time. Harry Haywood was one of them, but there were many people that they sent into the Deep South to organize black and white workers in the Deep South to have unions and against Jim Crow. The fight against Jim Crow, the fight for self-determination in the Black Belt, as they called it back then, became integral parts of the Communist Party's program in the Deep South and throughout the country.
So this is before Martin Luther King and Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that sort of thing?
This was in the 30s.
So how were they received in the South?
By who? By black people. They were well received. By the Southern plantation owners and whatnot, they were not well received at all. They used to, if they caught somebody in the South at that time that was a communist organizer, this happened a lot during the 20s, but also in the 30s. They would take them out into the woods, tie their legs to a log and bust their kneecaps and leave them there, So there was a lot of brutality and whatnot perpetrated against communist organizers going into the South. But this didn't stop them. They kept going. They kept organizing people. And eventually it got to the point where we're talking about thousands and thousands of people being organized, particularly during the hunger marches and whatnot of the 30s, And so the South became one of the greatest organizing drives in terms of the party in the country. In places like Alabama and whatnot, where you had Bessemer Steel, that was the industrial center of the South. At one time, 90% of the members of the Communist Party in that area were black. And what the party did was, for the first time in U.S. history, and actually for the first time since then, the Communist Party was effective in bringing about a real merger, a real fusion between the Black Liberation Movement and the Socialist Movement.
So how did they do that? How did the workers' movement relate to this, and how did they relate to the workers' movement around this question of black liberation?
Well, they did it on two fronts. They did it in fighting in the textile mills and the coal mines of the South, uniting the workers to form unions and whatnot, and they did it with regard to sharecropping, forming the first sharecroppers unions, because a lot of black people were at that time being held in bondage on these plantations as sharecroppers. They were in debt. They couldn't get out of their situation, and so the party organized sharecroppers unions in Alabama, in Tennessee, in Arkansas, in Missouri, and different places. And these sharecroppers unions united with the fight to bring organized labor into the South. This is the way in which the party dealt with that.
So, but trying to form unions in a place that was pretty much non-union as well, so it applied beyond just black people, but to all workers. Then.
Yeah, you can't have a union with just black people, particularly in the South, which at that time most of the workers in the textile industry were not black. They were mostly white workers, but there were black workers in the textile industry, and the first successful organizing drive that I think it was Laurel, North Carolina, that took place in the South with textile workers. The party refused to organize a union which did not include the black workers. They refused to organize a union for just white workers, And so it was in the dirt and blood of class struggle that white workers and black workers learned how to work together and fight together. And when they did a very heroic job of it.
So the Communist Party also during this time period had a national or international campaign for the Scottsboro Boys. And this was in my view, I guess, to try to break some of the lynching, Jim Crow, and the oppression that was going on in the South of the United States, but also other places, and raise some consciousness there. Could you tell our listeners that don't know what the Scottsboro Boys campaign is, what it was?
Yeah,
and
we don't talk about that a whole lot in the book, because the book concentrates mostly on working class struggles, and the Scottsboro Boys is not just that. The Scottsboro Boys had to do with lynching, and particularly legal lynching. These were some young men out of Alabama who had been accused of raping a white woman on a train. They did not do it. And so the party, through its International Labor Defense Organization, defended the Scottsboro Boys, and that turned into a historic struggle that eventually involved the NAACP and a whole lot of other forces, and eventually led to changing in laws that are still in effect today. For example, the right to a counsel. Which set the basis for the Miranda laws of the '60s, was brought about during that period. But it was a successful struggle in one sense, in that it brought a lot of attention to it, and a lot of Scottsboro Boys were freed as a result of that. But some of them did not get free until in the '70s. I was in a rally in New York in 1979. Where I saw the last Scottsboro boy to come out of prison. So this was a hard and bitter struggle, but it was mainly the party's role in fighting legal lynching and lynching in the South, but mainly legal lynching. There were a lot of cases that the party took up besides the Scottsboro Boys case, the Willie McGee case and other cases. There were a lot of cases, and some of the cases involved workers who had been like Angelo Herndon, who was a black worker, that they gave the death penalty to for a so-called insurrection that he was supposed to have been leading. That was around the same time in the Scottsboro cases. People don't hear about that case, but yeah, the party definitely led a very monumental struggle in terms of the Scottsboro Boys that set a lot of things in motion and laid another foundation stone for the civil rights movement that emerged later on during the 50s.
So you lift up the Communist Party in a big way, especially in the early part of the 20th century, for playing a major role in coming up with this line, which affected the whole international communist movement, and for implementing it here in the United States. But then, as we go forward, you have some criticism of the party. Particularly, I'm thinking about under the leadership of Earl Browder. And can you talk about what your criticisms are, and what you think happened to the Communist Party during that time period?
Well, what happened to the Communist Party during that time period left a indelible scar on the party, which exists to this day. And that is that the black liberation question was liquidated. Earl Browder, but he not only liquidated the Black Liberation Party, he tried to liquidate the party itself, which is where this thing ultimately leads, right? But he said that the Negro people no longer existed as a nation, and that the party should fight for the integration of the Negro people into the American nation, and not be so much engaged in the struggle for self-determination and equality. He said that the black folks in the South were being increasingly proletarianized, and so this eroded the economic basis for black people being a nation, and that was his position.
Why is that wrong? What's wrong with that?
Well, it's just not true. It's just not true. The class composition of black people as a nation has changed. The class composition was changing then. It had not quite changed as definitively as it is now. But the class composition had changed, where black people as a nation was no longer based on a landless peasantry in the Deep South. More and more blacks were being proletarianized in the Deep South, as well as all throughout the United States. Like it's particularly true in Alabama, but it's also true in North and South Carolina and Georgia and other places. Wherever there was industry, more and more black people was coming into it. Also, it's true in Louisiana with regard to the marine workers and so forth and so on. In the lumber industry, a lot of black workers was proletarianized, but the land base for the black nation is still there. It has not disappeared. It stretches from southern Delaware all the way into eastern Texas. It's there right now. 54% of the black people in this country live in the South now, in that same black belt, and black people in the South are still fighting for the right to self-determination. That's what the voting rights is all about. So his thesis is wrong, and it was also a betrayal of the struggle for socialism in this country.
So many of the people that call themselves socialists today don't accept, or at least or don't talk about political power for black people the way you are in your book and the way you do right now. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about why that is, or what's the problem here? Why aren't people seeing this?
Well, they don't see the centrality of the struggle for black liberation. They don't see that in the United States of North America, a republic founded on slavery and genocide, they don't see that you cannot have a path to socialism without black liberation, Chicano liberation, the liberation of the indigenous people. They don't see that. They take a puritanical or Puritan class approach, that this is a class question only. It's not a class question only. It's also a national question. And in so much it is a national question, it involves black people as a people. It involves the Chicano people as a people, as a nation, which consists of workers and non-workers. And the super exploitation and oppression of these people is what is at issue here. And if you're not addressing that, then you are not really paying attention to what Karl Marx said, that labor in the white skin cannot be free as long as it's sold and branded in the black skin. And today, just put the word racist oppression in there. As long as there's racist and national oppression, no part of the working class can be free, So that is where their mistake comes. They think that there's a way to socialism without addressing the national question, without seeing the special oppression of black people,
So in your thesis is that can't happen.
That cannot happen.
Yeah. So
in fact, look around the world. That has happened in no country that has taken the path of socialism. It hasn't happened in China. It's not happening in South Africa. It's not happening in the Philippines. It can't happen. In all of these places that I just mentioned, Vietnam, China, the Philippines, South Africa, so forth and so on, the national question is prominent, and the struggle for socialism takes place with that. There cannot be a struggle for socialism without that.
So Frank, you're a member of the Central Committee of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. So that organization, you think does this, and if so, how does that look on the ground for people trying to organize and for the members of Freedom Road?
Well, that's why I joined Freedom Road, because they do that, and how that looks on the ground is that we are actively engaged right now in struggles that speaks to what I'm talking about. For example, the struggle for community control of the police. That is directly related to the national question. We're talking about fighting for self-empowerment in terms of our community, where we will have the right to say who polices our communities and how our communities are policed. Who are the police? The police are agencies of the state, the same state that oppresses us. That's who the police are. So the police are very much involved in defending private property, the status quo, being the occupying army for the capitalists and imperialists in this country. And so we are fighting at that level to change this, to change these power relationships between the police and our communities, and move in the direction of self-determination for our people. That's a struggle that we've been engaged in Chicago, but now we're engaged in that struggle in over 22 different cities throughout the United States since the George Floyd Rebellion. And so we are putting this into practice. We are fighting in unconditional solidarity with black people and all oppressed people in this country against monopoly capitalism.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned George Floyd, how the murder of George Floyd changed the character of the black liberation movement in the United States and the battle for political power for black people?
Well, I don't think it changed the character of the black liberation movement. I think it brought about a political realignment, giving the black liberation movement a more central place in the struggle. What the murder of George Floyd did was to ignite a situation that was already there. It's like the match on the kerosene. You couldn't have had the inflammation if the kerosene hadn't been there, you know. So George Floyd was not the first to get murdered like that. There was Eric Garner and countless others, so many others that we have not seen on, online, that have not been live streamed. So people are tired, particularly black people. And so this was the spark that ignited a rebellion that had been seething underneath for a long time. And once this rebellion took place, something happened that we have not seen happen ever. And that is all 50 states of the United States. This was a black-led rebellion of over 25 million people in all 50 states of the United States. It was black-led, but most of the people that participated in it were not black, but it was black-led. It was a rebellion that resounded throughout the world. You can't hardly name a foreign capital where there was not a similar rebellion taking place, particularly in places like Britain and some of the Western European countries, but also where there was expressions of solidarity, like throughout South America and throughout Asia and Africa. So this was a forced realignment of politics. All you had to do was just pay attention to what was coming on over the news media. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to talk about this subject. In fact, our organization, the National Alliance Against Racist Political Repression, we raised more money without even asking for it. We didn't have no fundraiser online, but we got more donations of money from people during this rebellion than ever in our entire history. I'm talking about money in the hundreds of thousands. And the Black Lives Matter movement got money in the millions. Now, our money came principally from, I can't speak for another movement, but I know our money came principally from working people. How do I know that? Because we looked at the size of the donations. The size of the donations, they range from $15 to $200. That was the size of the donations. And we got over $200,000 with donation. So this, I'm just giving you some indices to show you that this was a change. This was a political realignment in the country. Trump would not have been defeated had this change not taken place, because this also led to a very dramatic voter turnout. Yes, it did. It led to, and they tell you that in Georgia, the organizers in Georgia say we got a big boost from the rebellion in 2020. That's why you got 2 Democratic senators out of Georgia now in the United States Congress. So it was a political realignment of the country, which we are still dealing with. The attempted coup by Donald Trump on January 6th, it was a response to the 2020 rebellion. It was the so-called white backlash,
So Frank, you're the executive director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression.
Right.
And so here we are in 2022, where this realignment is in place. What's the alliance? How are you looking forward? How are you looking from where we are today and next steps for the Black Liberation Movement and for the National Alliance?
Well, our agenda is clear. Our first priority is to defend the democratic rights of the people to organize and fight back. And we're doing this in 3 ways. We're doing this in terms of the struggle for community control of the police, because that's defending and extending our democratic rights, because saying that we have the right to say who polices our communities and how our communities police, that's a defense and an extension, We have a lot of political prisoners who are in prison as a result of going all the way back to the 60s of the Black Panther Party. We have a lot of Panthers who are still locked down as political prisoners. We had Leonard Peltier out of the American Indian Movement, who's the oldest held political prisoner in the United States right now. Maybe the world. And so we're doing that, and we're also doing voting rights. So these three things is what's top on our agenda right now. Defending the right to vote, that also is a defense and extension of our democratic rights.
So you mentioned Leonard Pelletier, who's a Native American activist. And then, I know you've been outspoken around the Palestinian struggle when Rasmia Uda, the beloved activist from Chicago, was deported.
Right.
And other movements, Filipinos, you've mentioned others. Why is it important for people that are leaders of the Black Liberation Movement to show solidarity with other national movements?
Because their struggle is our struggle. They're struggling against the same enemy that we're struggling against. And, we kind of like live in the belly of the beast. U.S. imperialism has its tentacles everywhere. And particularly with regard to the Palestinian movement and with regard to the Filipino movement. The International Policemen's Association, they train people in Israel and they train people in the Philippines, and the United States is the organizer and the perpetrator of that training. So they are all united. And so we, as an oppressed people, have to be united against them. So we have unconditional solidarity with the people in Palestine and with the people in the Philippines. And our last national conference, which was held on December the 4th and the 5th of last year, our Filipino members of the alliance, as well as our Palestinian members, introduced special resolutions of solidarity with their movements, and we adopted those resolutions.
Frank, it's always a joy to talk to you. I learned so much. Is there anything you want to add before we finish the interview?
No, I'm pretty exhausted right now.
Well, you've been putting in the work on behalf of the people, so you deserve a little bit of rest too, but not too much. We need you, comrade.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for this great opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Thanks for being with us.
Right on. All power to the people.
All power to the people. Wow. Like I said, Frank Chapman, one of the giants of our movement. Of course, we'll let you know how to get his book in the show notes. Also, the producer of this show, fightbacknews.org, I'd like to mention them. It's a good place to go to get other writings about Frank Chapman or about the National Alliance Against Racist Political Repression. We'll put information on how you can get a hold of the National Alliance in our show notes, and how to get a hold of Freedom Road, for that matter, in our show notes as well, so people can find that. So look at, also fightbacknews.org. If you want to reach us on Twitter, we're at Fightback News, Instagram at Fightback News. And again, I just want to encourage people to, give us 5 stars and give us positive review, and tell your friends about this. We want to promote Fightback Radio as widely as we can. And finally, I want to thank Vince Olson and Shane Tremley, our production team, who do just a fabulous job putting this all together and making this all happen. And I make more mistakes than you could guess, and they make it all sound good. So I want to thank those guys for the really good work that they've done. I want to thank Frank Chapman for taking the time to sit down and talk to us. It was a real joy to do that. So for the entire Fight Back Radio team, I'm Richard Berg saying until next time, all power to the people.